The great doors of Blackwood Manor opened before Vivian could knock, and the cold rushed out to meet her as if the house itself wished her gone. She had pictured this moment so many times on the long voyage home. A warm hand, a familiar voice, Julian standing in the light with that crooked smile he wore when he forgot to be a duke. She had carried that picture through 3 months of fever wards and bloodied linens, through nights when the only thing keeping her on her feet was the thought that someone, somewhere, was waiting for her. But there was no warm hand. There was only marble, polished so bright she could see her own tired face in it, and a silence that pressed against her ears. "Miss Ashford," the butler's voice was careful, almost sorry. "His Grace will see you in the foyer." The foyer. Not the drawing room, where they had once sat by the fire while she read aloud to him. Not the morning room, where his late father had blessed their engagement 2 winters past. The foyer, where tradesmen waited with their account books and their hats in their hands. Vivian lifted her chin and walked in. Julian stood at the foot of the grand staircase in a dark green coat cut close to his shoulders, every button gleaming. He was thinner than she remembered, and there was a stiffness in the way he held his left side, but he was still the handsomest man she had ever known. Beside him stood the Dowager Duchess, his mother, draped in black silk and pearls, her mouth set in a line as straight and hard as a fire iron. "Vivian," Julian said. He did not come forward. "Julian?" She stopped a few paces away, suddenly aware of how she must look to them. Her traveling dress, once a soft blue, had faded to the color of weak tea. The hem was frayed from kneeling on infirmary floors. Her gloves were worn through at 2 fingers, and she had not slept properly in a week. The Dowager Duchess made a small sound through her nose. "You've come a great distance," Julian said. "I trust the crossing was bearable."
"It was a crossing,"
Vivian said simply.
"I have seen worse."
"Yes, I imagine you have." His eyes moved over her, and she watched something cool and final settle behind them. "You went to do good work. I have never doubted that. The wounded soldiers of that infirmary were fortunate to have you."
"Then say what you brought me here to say,"
she said.
"and let us both stop pretending this is a welcome."
A flush crept up his throat. The Dowager Duchess stepped forward, and it was she who spoke, in the smooth, practiced voice of a woman who had ended a great many conversations exactly as she pleased. "My dear girl, you are sensible. That has always been your finest quality, sensibility, so you will understand. A duchess is not merely a wife. She is the face of a great house. She must receive ambassadors. She must host the county. She must have hands fit to be kissed by lords." Her gaze dropped, pointedly, to Vivienne's ruined gloves. "Yours, I fear, are the hands of a washerwoman." Vivienne did not flinch. She had held men together while they screamed. She had pressed her palms to wounds that would have made these people faint where they stood. If her hands were rough, they were rough from saving lives. "Julian," she said quietly, "is this your mother speaking, or you?" For one breath, she thought she saw the old Julian flicker behind his eyes, the boy who had laughed with her in the rain, who had said he cared nothing for titles. Then the Duke returned, and the boy was gone. "You are a good woman," he said, "but you are not Duchess material. I am sorry. I have provided for you. It is more than fair." He gestured, and the butler came forward bearing a small velvet pouch. The dull clink of coins inside it was the loudest thing in the room. Vivian looked at the pouch. Then she looked at Julian, really looked at him, at the proud set of his jaw and the cold green of his coat, and something inside her, something that had been bleeding quietly since the moment the doors opened, simply stopped. She did not cry. She did not argue. She reached into her own coat and drew out a battered tin flask, dented and scratched, the kind a soldier carried into the field. "You left this behind," she said. The night before you went to war. You asked me to keep it safe until you came home. I kept it through everything." She set it gently on the marble at his feet. "Keep your coins, your grace. I have no need of charity, and it seems neither of us has need of the other." She turned, the worn hem of her dress sweeping the spotless floor, and walked out through the great doors she had hoped never to leave by. Behind her, the Duke stood, frozen, the flask glinting at his feet, his mother's triumphant words dying in her throat. He opened his mouth. No sound came. Outside, a public coach waited in the grey morning, its driver flicking the reins. Vivienne climbed aboard without once looking back, and the manor, and the man, grew smaller and smaller until the Yorkshire mist swallowed them whole. The train shuddered northward through the dark, and the rain came at the windows in long silver streaks, lit now and then by the glow of a passing signal lamp. Vivienne sat alone in the third-class carriage on a hard wooden bench, her traveling case wedged beside her knee. The air smelled of damp wool, coal smoke, and the cold tin of the carriage walls. 2 seats down, an old woman slept with her cheek against a bundle of laundry, and across the way, a young man in a workman's cap stared out at the blackness, his lunch pail balanced on his lap. None of them knew her. None of them cared who she had nearly been. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Vivienne felt the strange relief of being no one at all. She did not cry. She had decided, somewhere between the manor gates and the station platform, that she would not waste a single tear on Blackwood. Tears were for the dying boys she had not been able to save. They were not for a man too proud to recognize what stood before him. When the conductor passed and clipped her ticket, she counted her savings under the dim swing of the carriage lamp. She tipped the small purse into her palm and laid the coins out one by one on her knee. A handful of shillings, a few pennies, the wages of 3 months' work in the infirmary, paid in coin so worn the king's face had nearly rubbed away. It was not much. It would feed her a fortnight, perhaps, if she was careful. It would not buy her a future. And yet, sitting there in the rattling dark, she did not feel afraid. She reached into her case and drew out her old medical journals, 3 thin volumes bound in cracked leather, their pages crammed with her own small, neat hand. Notes on fevers, sketches of bone setting, pages and pages on the thing her fellow nurses had laughed at her for. Cleanliness, the boiling of bandages, the scrubbing of hands before a man was ever touched. She had watched, with her own eyes, wards where that simple discipline was kept lose half as many men to rot and fever as the wards where it was not. The surgeons had called her notions womanish nonsense. The dead had proved her right. She turned to the back of the last journal, where a few blank leaves remained, and uncapped her fountain pen. The nib scratched faintly under the drum of the rain. "What I know," she wrote at the top of the page, then beneath it, in a column. "Cleanliness, quick hands, honest prices, no fear of hard work." On the opposite page, she wrote a second heading, "What the world lacks." She had heard the talk on the docks and in the stations. The great manufacturing towns to the south and west were swelling by the day. Manchester, Bolton, Preston, packed with men and women who had come from the fields to feed the looms and the furnaces. They worked themselves raw. They crushed fingers in machinery and burned their arms at the forges and coughed black into their handkerchiefs. And there were scarcely any doctors among them, for what physician of standing wished to set up his brass plate in a street that stank of soot and tallow? The fine doctors stayed where the fine money was. They powdered their wigs and bled their wealthy patients, and never once washed the filth from beneath their nails. Vivienne had treated their kind. She had treated for their kind, in a manner she would never see again. She was finished with grateful nobles and ungrateful ones alike. She pressed the pen to the page and began, in earnest, to plan. A storefront, small and cheap, in a working district where the rents were low and the need was great. A back room she could keep spotless. A kettle always on the boil for clean water and clean linen. She would charge a fair price, and a smaller one for those who could not pay the full, and nothing at all for a child. She would treat the man who set the rivets and the girl who tended the spindles, and she would treat them the way she had been trained to treat dying soldiers: fast, clean, and without flinching. The plan grew across the page as the miles fell away behind her. Where the lamp dimmed, she squinted and wrote on. She listed what she would need to purchase first: carbolic, lint, a good pair of scissors, a strong wooden table she could scrub down between patients. She listed what she would do without: fine furnishings, a brass plate, a maid. She did not need a manor to do good work. She had learned that much in a tent full of the wounded, where a clean cot and a steady hand had been worth more than every chandelier in Yorkshire. Somewhere past midnight, the rain began to ease. The young man in the cap had fallen asleep, and the old woman snored softly into her laundry. Vivian capped her pen and held the journal against her chest, looking out at the dark shapes of the country sliding past, the black hedgerows, the huddled cottages, the far-off lights of a town just beginning to show on the horizon. She thought, just once, of the dented flask lying on the marble floor where she had left it. Then she let the thought go, the way she had learned to let go of so many things. The train carried her on toward Lancashire, toward the smoke and the iron and the work that waited there. And for the first time since the doors of Blackwood Manor had opened against her, Vivian Ashford allowed herself a small, fierce smile. She was not running away from anything. She was going somewhere. 3 weeks later, the bell above the door of the Hope Street Infirmary rang for the very first time. It was a small bell, bought second-hand from a chandler who was closing his shop, and it gave a thin, bright sound that Vivian had come to love in the few days she had it hung. The storefront beneath it was narrow and plain, squeezed between a rope-maker's and a yard where they cast iron bars for the mills. From dawn, the air rang with the clang of hammers and the deep cough of the furnaces, and a fine gray grit settled over everything, drifting in under the door no matter how often she swept. Vivian had made the place her own, all the same. The front room held a single long bench for those who waited, a small stove, and a counter she had sanded and scrubbed until the old stains lifted. Behind a curtain of clean linen lay her treatment room, and there she would tolerate no grit at all. The wooden table gleamed from washing. A kettle sat always on the boil. Glass jars stood in a neat row on the shelf, each one labeled in her careful hand: carbolic, lint, salt, dried yarrow. She had spent nearly the last of her savings on them, and she did not regret a penny. The trouble was that no one came. For 2 days the bell stayed silent. The men of the district passed her window and slowed and stared and walked on. A woman lady doctor, with her sleeves rolled and her hands red from scrubbing, was a thing they had never seen, and they did not trust what they had never seen. Vivian heard the talk through the thin wall, that she was a fraud, that she was a fallen gentlewoman, that no proper healer would set up in a street like this one. She kept her kettle boiling and said nothing, and waited. On the third morning, the door banged open and the bell jangled hard, and 2 foundrymen half carried a third between them. "He's gone and turned his ankle on the casting floor," the larger of them said, breathing heavily. "Can't put no weight on it. The works doctor don't come till Thursday, and he's no use when he does." He looked at Vivian with open doubt. "They say you mend folk. That true, missus?" "Lay him on the bench," Vivian said. The injured man was young, his face gray with pain, his boot already swelling tight around the joint. His friends hovered as she knelt and eased the boot off, gently, talking low to him the whole while, the way she had learned to talk to frightened soldiers. The ankle was badly turned, but not broken. She felt along the bone with steady fingers and knew it at once. "You've sprained it, not snapped it," she told him. "You'll keep the leg and you'll keep the walking. Hold still." She washed her hands first. The men watched her do it, frowning, as though she were performing some strange rite. Then she bound the ankle firm and clean, packed it with cloth soaked in cold water to bring the swelling down, and showed the friends how to keep it raised. The whole of it took her not a quarter of an hour. When she was done, the young man tested his foot and found that the worst of the pain had eased and the gray had gone from his face. "How much, then?" the big man asked, reaching for a thin purse, braced for robbery. "Tuppence," Vivienne said. "And he's to rest it 3 days and come back to me so I can look at it again. No charge for the second visit." The men stared at her. Tuppence was less than they paid for ale. Word of that tuppence ran through the foundry district faster than any fever. By the next morning, a woman brought a child. By the afternoon, a grizzled puddler came in with a gash across his palm, and instead of binding it over the dirt, as the works doctor always did, Vivienne washed the wound until it ran clean, then closed it neat. He flinched at the sting of the carbolic and grumbled that the old way never hurt so much. "The old way also leaves you with a poisoned hand a week later," Vivienne said, "and a fever to follow, and sometimes no hand at all. Mine stings now and heals clean. You may choose." The puddler chose. He came back a week later with the wound knitting pink and healthy, and he told every man at the furnace about it. She did not understand at first why her methods worked so plainly when the proper doctors scoffed at them. She only knew what the infirmary had taught her, that the unseen filth on a hand or a blade was a thing more dangerous than any blade itself, and that boiling and scrubbing drove it off. The men of Hope Street did not need the reason. They needed only to see their mates walk away mended instead of crippled, and that they saw again and again. By the end of that first month, the thin bell above her door rang a dozen times a day. The bench was rarely empty. They came to her with crushed fingers and chest coughs, and they came because she was quick, and because she did not flinch, and because she charged a price an honest worker could pay. One evening, as she banked the stove and wiped down her gleaming table by the last of the light, Vivienne stood a moment in the quiet and listened to the furnaces roaring beyond the wall. She had crossed an ocean to be told she was fit for nothing. Here, in the soot and the iron, she had found that she was fit for everything that mattered. A month after Vivienne had walked out through his doors, Duke Julian Blackwood woke in the grey hour before dawn to a pain he had not felt since the war. It began in his left side, low beneath the ribs, where the surgeon's stitches had closed an old wound years before. He had carried it home from the campaign half-mended, a deep tear through the muscle that had never quite forgiven him. For a long while it had troubled him only in the cold, a dull ache he had learned to ignore. But 3 days past, he had insisted on riding out to inspect the far tenant farms himself, against the advice of his steward, and somewhere over the rough ground, the old hurt had pulled and torn afresh. Now he lay in the great carved bed of the master bedroom, the heavy velvet curtains drawn back, and the pain had teeth. When he tried to rise, it caught him so sharply that the breath went out of him, and he fell back against the pillows, his shirt damp with sweat. The Dowager Duchess sent for doctors at once, the finest in the county, the very men who attended the great houses for 50 miles around. They arrived in their dark coats and their powdered wigs, carrying leather cases of polished instruments, and they bowed and murmured and frowned over him with great solemnity. Julian watched them work through a haze of fever, and even in his pain, something in him grew uneasy. The first doctor pressed at the swollen wound with fingers that had not been washed, fingers that had come straight from his carriage and his morning bread. He prescribed a poultice of bread and herbs, bound it tight over the torn flesh, and declared that the heat would draw out the bad humors. The second doctor, called when the fever rose instead of falling, bled Julian from the arm to balance him, and applied a fresh poultice over the old one without ever once looking beneath the binding to see what festered there. By the third day, the wound had gone hot and angry, the skin around it darkening, and the smell that rose when they at last unwound the cloth made even the Dowager Duchess press a handkerchief to her face and turn away.
It must be drawn tighter,
the elder doctor said, frowning.
The poultice has not yet done its work.
It has done nothing but rot him, snapped a younger physician who had been summoned from York, a sharp-eyed man not yet old enough to be set in the old ways. You have bound filth against an open wound and sealed it in. The man needs the wound opened, cleaned, and kept clean, not smothered.
Clean?
The elder doctor drew himself up.
I have tended dukes and earls for 30 years, sir. I'll not be lectured on washing like a scullery maid.
They argued over him as though he were a side of meat. Julian lay listening, his head burning, and through the fog of fever, a single clear thought rose and would not leave him. He had heard those words before, opened, cleaned, kept clean. He had heard them spoken in a soft, certain voice in the firelight of the drawing room 2 winters past, when a young woman had read to him from her medical journals and told him of the wards overseas where men lived because their nurses scrubbed their hands. He had smiled at her then, indulgent, and thought it a charming enthusiasm. He had not believed a word of it. Vivienne. She had described this very thing. She had told him, in that quiet way of hers, that more soldiers died of dirty bindings than of the wounds themselves, and that the cure was so simple the great surgeons refused to believe it. He had laughed and called her his clever girl and changed the subject to the hunt. Now he lay, rotting in his own bed, while 2 learned men quarreled over whether washing was beneath a gentleman, and the woman who had known the answer all along was gone, sent away by his own cold hand with a pouch of coins for her trouble. "Send them out," Julian said. The doctors did not hear him at first. He gathered what strength he had and said it again, louder, so that the room fell silent. "Send them out, both of them. I'll have no more poultices."
"Julian," his mother began, "you are not yourself. The fever has—"
"I am more myself than I have been in a month," he said. His voice shook, but his eyes were clear. "Mother, the woman who knew how to mend this, the one you and I sent away, where is she now?" The Dowager Duchess went very still. The pearls at her throat caught the light.
"I have no notion. She took some train, I am told, to the manufacturing towns. Manchester, perhaps, or one of those dreadful places. It hardly signifies. She is gone."
"It signifies a great deal," Julian said quietly. He turned his face to the window, where the grey Yorkshire dawn was breaking over the moors, and he thought of a worn blue dress and a pair of work-roughened hands, and a dented tin flask he had found that same evening still lying on the marble of the foyer, where no servant had dared to move it. He had told her she was not fit to be a duchess. He had not understood, until this moment of fever and stink and learned men squabbling like crows, that she might be the only person in all of England who could save his life. The fever climbed higher as the sun rose, and in the great cold house the proud Duke understood, far too late, exactly what he had thrown away. 6 weeks on, the Hope Street Infirmary had outgrown its own walls. The thin bell above the door scarcely stopped ringing now. Where once Vivienne had waited 2 days for a single patient, she now arrived before dawn to find men already gathered on the step, caps in hand, and a queue that wound past the ropemaker's window by the time she lit her stove. She had taken the empty room above the shop and turned it into a second ward, with cots for those too ill to be sent home, and she had knocked through the wall to the storeroom to make space for more. She could not have managed it alone, and she no longer had to. The first of her helpers was a sharp young woman named Bess, who had come in months back with a burned hand and stayed to ask question after question while it healed. Bess had a quick mind and a quicker pair of hands, and she had learned to boil the linen and scrub the table and bind a clean wound nearly as well as Vivian herself. The second was a widow called Mrs. Hartley, older and slower but steady as stone, who kept the little ones calm and never once turned faint at the sight of a hurt that would have sent a fine lady running. Vivian trained them both, as she had been trained, to wash before they touched, to keep the grit from the wounds, to flinch at nothing. The three women together made the place hum. The front room stayed bright and orderly, the bench wiped down between patients, the floor swept clear of the foundry grit twice a day. There was always the smell of carbolic and boiling water, sharp and clean, cutting through the soot that hung over the rest of the street. Men who had never in their lives been touched by a healer who washed her hands first now came to expect it and grumbled at any clinic that did otherwise. It was on one such busy morning that the carriage of Mr. Edmund Croft drew up outside. Croft owned 3 mills and a great share of the ironworks, and he was not a man accustomed to waiting on a bench among labourers. He came in with a gold-headed cane and a coat that cost more than Vivian's storefront earned in a season, and he looked about the crowded little room with the air of a man pricing a horse. "Miss Ashford," he did not remove his hat, "I have heard a great deal about you. They say you have made something quite remarkable here." "I have made a place where the people of this district can be treated honestly," Vivian said, not pausing in the binding of a child. "If you've an ailment, sir, you may take a place on the bench like the rest." Croft laughed, as though she had made a fine joke. "I have come with a proposal, not an ailment. I'll be plain. A talent like yours is wasted on dockhands and spinners who can pay you in pennies. I should like to buy your practice entire. The lease, the name, the lot of it. I'll set you up in handsome rooms in the better part of town, fit it out fine, and you'll attend none but gentlefolk and the families of my fellow owners. You'll earn in a week what you scrape here in a year. What do you say?" The room had gone quiet. The men on the bench were watching her, and so were Bess and Mrs. Hartley, their hands stilled at their work. The mother of the child held her breath. Vivian tied off the bandage, patted the little one, and sent her back to her mother before she straightened and looked Croft full in the face. "And these people?" she asked. "When I am tucked away in my handsome rooms, mending the sprains of mill owners, who treats the man whose arm is caught in your machinery? Who washes the burn on the girl who tends your looms?" "There are charity wards for such cases." "There are charity wards where they bind filth against open wounds and call it medicine," Vivian said. "I have seen what those wards do. I have buried what those wards do." She shook her head, calm and final. "I did not cross an ocean and walk away from everything I knew to spend my days dabbing the gout of rich men. The Hope Street Infirmary is not for sale, Mr. Croft. Not for any sum you can name." Croft's smile thinned. He was a man unused to refusal, and for a moment something hard moved behind his eyes. Then he glanced about the room, at the orderly cots, the clean linen, the children who plainly trusted her, the men who were not afraid, and the hardness gave way to something more thoughtful. "You are either a fool, Miss Ashford,"
he said slowly,
"or the only honest healer I have met in 20 years. I find I cannot quite decide which."
"You need not decide," she said. "You need only let me work." To her surprise, Croft inclined his head.
"Then let me make a different offer, one you may find harder to refuse. I'll not buy your practice. I'll fund it. Whatever you need, beds, supplies, a larger building when the time comes, send the accounts to me. Treat your dockhands and your spinners to your heart's content. A town runs on the backs of well men, and you keep more of them well than any doctor I've paid."
He tapped his cane and turned for the door.
"Consider it an investment. I have always had an eye for what others overlook."
He left her standing among her patients, the bell jangling behind him, and Bess let out a breath she had been holding. Did that truly just happen? Vivienne looked at the crowded, clean, busy little room she had built from nothing.
"It seems," she said quietly, "that doing the work properly is its own kind of fortune." And she rolled her sleeves and called the next patient in. 2 months after she had opened her doors, a carriage came down Hope Street that did not belong there. It was a tall, glossy thing, black as a beetle's back, drawn by a matched pair of greys whose coats had never known the touch of foundry grit. It had no crest upon its door. Someone had taken care that it should carry no name. But everything about it, from the polished brass of its lamps to the fine cut of the coachman's coat, spoke of a great house and a great deal of money. It picked its way down the muddy street like a swan among ducks, and the whole district stopped to stare. Children left off their games. Women came to their doorsteps. The men at the ironworks set down their tools and gathered at the yard fence to watch. A carriage like that meant trouble of one sort or another, and the people of Hope Street had learned to be wary of trouble that arrived in fine clothes. The carriage drew up before Vivian's window. The door opened, and a man climbed down with great difficulty into the mud. Vivian, watching from her doorway with a strip of clean lint still in her hand, knew him at once, though he was much changed. It was Hargrove, the butler of Blackwood Manor, the same careful, sorry-voiced man who had shown her into that cold foyer to be cast out. But the proud servant she remembered was gone. This man was gray-faced and trembling, his fine livery hanging loose on a frame that had plainly not slept nor eaten well in days. He had the look of a man who had ridden through every kind of weather and seen something at the end of his journey that had frightened him badly. "Miss Ashford." He came toward her, and his voice cracked on her name. Thank God I have found you. I feared you'd gone further still." "Mr. Hargrove," she did not step aside from her door. "You are a long way from Yorkshire." "I have come for you. I have come to beg you." The old man's hands shook as he reached toward her. "It is His Grace, the Duke. His old wound has reopened, and the doctors have made it worse, far worse. They bind it and bleed him, and the fever climbs and climbs. He cannot rise from his bed. He cannot keep food. The York physician says—" Hargrove's voice dropped and his eyes filled. "The York physician says if it is not turned within the week, it will turn to the worst, and there will be no turning it back at all." Behind her, in the quiet of the doorway, Vivienne felt the words land. She kept her face still. She had learned long ago to keep her face still before the frightened. "And so they have sent for me," she said. "They have. I have." Hargrove drew out a leather purse, heavy and full, and held it toward her in both shaking hands. "Her Grace bids me offer you 10 times your yearly rent here, paid this very day, only to come north and tend him. 20 times, if it is not enough. Name your figure, miss. Name anything. Only come." The street had gone very quiet. Vivienne was aware of the men at the fence, of Bess in the window behind her, of the patients waiting on the bench within. She was aware, too, of the strangeness of it, that the very house which had handed her a pouch of coins to be rid of her now sent a heavier purse to fetch her back. She thought of the cold marble. She thought of not Duchess material, spoken in that smooth, sure voice. She thought of the dented flask she had laid at his feet. Then she thought of the man rotting in a fine bed because 2 learned fools would not wash their hands, and of all the men she had watched die of the very same neglect, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she felt no triumph in it at all, only a tired sort of certainty. "Put the purse away, Mr. Hargrove," she said. "I'll not be bought to a sickbed, nor will I refuse one. That is not how I work." The old man's face crumpled in confusion. "Then you will not come?" "I did not say that." Vivian stepped out at last onto her own threshold, into the grey light, and her voice carried clear down the watching street. "I have a clinic full of people who need me here. I have a man upstairs whose leg I am keeping. I cannot abandon them and ride 2 days north for one patient, however grand he is, while these go untended." She paused. "But I am the only one, you say, who knows how to mend him. Then there is
one way it may be done. Anything, miss. He must come to me. She said it plainly, without heat. If the Duke of Blackwood wishes to be treated, he must travel to this street and pass through that door and wait his turn on that bench, the same as every dockhand and spinner in this district. I'll not go to him. He'll come to me.
Like any other man who is sick and needs help. Those are my terms, and they are the only ones I have. Hargrove stared at her. The purse hung forgotten in his hands. Miss, he is a duke. He can scarcely sit a carriage. To ask him to come here, to be seen waiting among the people he thinks beneath him, Vivian finished quietly. Yes, those are my terms, Mr. Hargrove. Carry them back to Yorkshire. He may take them or leave them. The fever, I think, will help him decide. She turned and went back into her patients and left the old butler standing alone in the mud beside his beautiful, useless carriage, with the whole of Hope Street watching. 2 days later, against every protest his mother could muster and every warning of the York physician, Duke Julian Blackwood travelled north to Manchester. They had fitted out a private railway carriage for him, padded and curtained and warmed with hot bricks wrapped in flannel, for he could not have borne the public seats. He lay on a made-up couch beneath a heavy travelling rug, propped on cushions, and every jolt of the rails sent a fresh wave of pain through his side. A manservant sat by to tend him, and Hargrove rode in the corner with his hat upon his knees, watching his master with anxious eyes. The fever had ebbed a little since they had ceased the poultices entirely, on Hargrove's blunt insistence, but Julian was weak as a kitten, his face the colour of tallow, his fine clothes hanging loose. He had argued against the journey for the better part of a day. A duke did not go crawling to a clinic in a soot-blackened street to wait on a bench among labourers. It was unthinkable. His mother had wept and railed, and called Vivian's terms an insult past bearing, an act of spite from a low woman who wished only to humble him. But the fever did not care for his title. The wound did not care for his pride. And somewhere in the long, sleepless night that followed Hargrove's return, lying alone in the great carved bed with the smell of his own rotting flesh in his nostrils, Julian had understood a plain thing at last, that he would rather sit on her bench and live than die in his fine sheets with his dignity intact. So he had given the order, and now the country slid past the carriage window, and he watched it go. It was not the country he knew. The green moors and the neat hedgerows gave way, mile by mile, to something he had never troubled himself to look at. Rows upon rows of small brick houses, crammed shoulder to shoulder, tall chimneys without number, each one breathing its column of black smoke into a sky the color of dishwater. Canals choked with barges, great mills like cliffs of brick, their 1,000 windows lit against the gloom, and pouring out of their gates at the change of the shift, a tide of people, men, women scarcely tall enough to reach a loom, grey with the work, hurrying, endless. This was where she had come. This was the world he had told her she was not fine enough to leave behind. Julian pressed his hot forehead to the cool glass and felt the shame of it settle over him heavier than the fever. He had thought, when he handed her that pouch of coins, that he was being merciful, generous even. He had pictured her fading quietly back into the modest life she had come from, grateful in time for the comfort he had provided. It had not once crossed his mind that she might walk into a place like this and build something, that the hands he had called a washerwoman's hands might raise a clinic out of nothing, might mend the very people his learned doctors would not deign to touch. He had measured her by the standards of his drawing room and found her wanting. He had never thought to ask what she might be worth in the world beyond it. "Hargrove," he said. His voice was thin. "Your Grace? When you found her, what was she doing?" The old butler considered. "Binding a knee, Your Grace. There was a queue out the door, folk waiting on the step. He hesitated. "They looked at her the way the tenants used to look at your father, as though she were the one good thing they could count upon. Julian closed his eyes. He thought of the fire-lit evening when she had read to him from her journals and told him, in that quiet, certain voice, how men lived or died by the cleanliness of a hand. He had smiled and called it a charming notion. She had not been telling him a charming notion. She had been telling him the truth, and he had been too proud and too comfortable to hear it. Now that same truth was the only thread by which his life still hung, and he was being carried toward it like baggage, north into the smoke, to beg it of the woman he had cast out. "I told her she was not Duchess material," Julian said, half to himself. "I believe those were my words. Not Duchess material." Hargrove said nothing. There was nothing to be said. "I had it the wrong way about," Julian went on, very low. "It was never that she was not fine enough for my world. It is that my world was never fine enough to deserve her. And I could not see it, Hargrove, because I had never once looked beyond the end of my own nose." The carriage rattled on. The chimneys grew thicker, the smoke darker, the brick closer on every side, until at last the train began to slow, and the great soot-stained station of Manchester swallowed them in. Steam hissed, doors slammed. The roar of the manufacturing city came at him through the carriage walls, hammering, shouting, the deep, ceaseless thunder of the mills. They lifted him into a hired chair to carry him out, for he could not walk, and as they bore him through the press of the platform, Julian looked up at the iron rafters and the falling soot and the hurrying gray crowds, and he understood that he was not bringing Vivienne back to his world. He was entering hers, sick and humbled and entirely at her mercy. And he found, somewhat to his own astonishment, that he did not resent it. He had spent his pride somewhere on the road north. What was left in its place felt very like hope, small and trembling, and quite unfamiliar. The chair turned toward Hope Street. Julian let himself be carried on. The bell above the door of the Hope Street infirmary rang, and the Duke of Blackwood was carried in among the spinners and the dock hands to wait his turn. Vivienne did not stop her work to greet him. She was binding a docker's strained shoulder when they bore him in, and she finished the binding and gave the man his instructions, and only then did she look up. Julian sat slumped in the hired chair where his servants had set him, grey and trembling, his fine coat dark with the sweat of fever. The whole bench of waiting patients had gone silent at the sight of him. He met her eyes across the crowded little room, and whatever he had braced himself to find there, he did not find it. There was no triumph in her face. There was no anger. There was nothing at all but the calm, measuring look she gave every patient who came through her door. "You'll wait your turn, Your Grace," she said. "There are two before you." And she made him wait. He waited while she dressed a scalded forearm. He waited while she dosed a feverish patient and sent its mother home with clean instructions. Only when the bench was clear did she draw back the linen curtain and nod him through to the treatment room, and his servants carried him in and laid him on the scrubbed wooden table, and she sent them out to wait in the street. Then it was only the two of them, in the small, clean room that smelled of carbolic and boiling water, with the furnaces roaring faintly beyond the wall. She washed her hands. He watched her do it, the same strange rite the foundryman had once frowned at, and something in his throat tightened, for he knew now what it meant, and what it had cost him not to believe in it. "Vivienne," he said, "I must speak." "You must lie still," she said, "and let me see what those doctors have done to you." She unwound the binding with quick, careful hands. The wound beneath was a ruin, hot and swollen, the skin angry, the work of the poultices plain to see. She did not flinch. She had seen far worse on far younger men. She cleaned it with a steady hand, and where it had to be opened to drain, she opened it, talking low and even the whole while, as she had learned to do with frightened soldiers, and though he gripped the edge of the table white-knuckled, she did not let the pain rush her. She washed it until it ran clean. She dressed it in fresh boiled linen. She worked as though he were any man at all. "You were right," he said through his teeth. "All of it. What you told me by the fire that winter, about the washing, about the wards. I called it a charming notion. I have been dying of my own foolishness, and you," his voice broke, "you alone knew the cure. Hold still. I have had a great deal of time to think, lying in that bed. 2 days on a train with nothing to do but look at what you built." He drew a ragged breath. "I was wrong about you, Vivian. I was wrong in every way a man can be wrong. I told you that you were not fit to be a duchess. The truth is that I was not fit to be your husband, and I was too proud to see it." His hand reached for hers where it worked. "Let me put it right. Come back to Yorkshire. Be my wife. Be my duchess, properly this time, and I'll spend the rest of my days—" "Your Grace!" She drew her hand back, not unkindly, and finished tying off the dressing. "There, it will heal now, if you keep it clean and let my methods be. You'll have a scar and a stiffness in the cold, but you'll keep your life and your leg both." She straightened and looked at him, and her face was perfectly composed. "You have come a long way to say all that," she said, "and I believe you mean it. I believe you have changed. But it has come too late for the thing you are asking, and I think, if you are honest, you already know it." She wiped her hands on a clean cloth. "When I needed you to see me, you saw a worn dress and a pair of rough hands. I have built a life out of those rough hands since. It is a good life. It is mine. I did not build it as a way to wait for you to come to your senses. I built it because it was worth building." "Vivian." "You are not a suitor here," she said gently. "You are a patient, and you will mend, and you will go home, and you will be the better for having been made to wait on that bench, I think." She crossed to her shelf and took down a small bottle of clear fluid, and she pressed it into his hand and folded his fingers over it. "Saline, clean salt water. Bathe the wound with it twice a day until the dressing may come off. Your fine doctors will tell you it is nonsense. Do not listen to them." He stared down at the little bottle in his hand. There was no ring in it, no second chance, only the cure he had come for, given plainly, with no strings at all. "That will be 5 shillings, Vivian said. "The same as any man. Hargrove may settle it on your way out." And she drew back the linen curtain and called the next patient in. Julian sat a long moment on the scrubbed table, the bottle of saline cool in his palm, and understood that she had given him exactly what he had asked for the day he sent her away. His freedom, his coin's worth, and not one thing more. 6 months later, on a bright spring morning, the largest crowd Hope Street had ever seen gathered before a great new building of red Manchester brick. It stood 3 stories tall at the corner where the ropemaker's yard had once been, its windows clean and many, its doors thrown wide. Above the entrance, carved into pale stone, ran the words, "The Manchester Medical Institute." It was the first of its kind in all the region, a true training hospital, with wards kept spotless, with a room for teaching, with beds enough for 50, and space to grow. It had been raised in part by Edmund Croft's money, and in larger part by the pennies and shillings of the very people it was built to serve, who had given what little they had, so that the woman who had mended them might mend 1,000 more. Vivian stood on the steps in a good grey dress, plain and well made, her hands folded before her. They were still a healer's hands, still roughened by years of scrubbing and boiling and honest work, and she had long since ceased to think of them as anything to hide. Bess stood at her one side in a clean white apron, a trained nurse now in her own right, and Mrs. Hartley at the other. Below them, filling the street, were the dock hands and the spinners and the foundrymen and their wives and their children. The whole of the district she had given herself to, come to see what they had built together. She did not make a long speech. She had never been a woman of many words. "There are doctors in this country," she said, her voice carrying clear in the morning air, "who will tell you that medicine is a thing for the rich, and that the poor must make do with what is left over. I have spent my life proving them wrong. In this house, every man, woman, and child who comes through the door will be treated the same, clean and quick and honestly, whatever the color of their coin. And in this house, we will teach others to do the same, so that when I am gone, there will be 100 hands trained to carry the work on." She looked out over the upturned faces. "You built this, every one of you. It is yours." The cheer that went up rolled down Hope Street and rattled the windows of the ironworks, and the bell of the old little infirmary, which she had kept and hung above the new doors, rang out bright and thin over all of it. Far to the north, in Yorkshire, Duke Julian Blackwood read of it in the newspaper. His wound had healed clean, exactly as she had promised. He bathed it in salt water twice a day, against the protests of his mother and the bafflement of his county doctors, and the scar had knit pink and healthy, and the fever had never returned. He was a whole man again, and a wealthy one, lord of a great house and broad lands and everything a man was meant to want. He sat alone at the long table in his dining hall, where one place was laid amid the silver and the candlelight, and he read the small column about the opening of the Manchester Medical Institute and the woman who had founded it, and he set the paper down very carefully and looked at the empty chairs. The manor had grown quiet around him these 6 months. The hunts and the dinners and the county balls that had once filled his days now seemed to him like so much painted scenery, fine to look at and hollow behind. He had everything he had once believed a duke ought to have, and he had never in his life felt so poor. The pride that had filled the house had drained away, and nothing had risen to take its place but the memory of a small, clean room that smelled of carbolic, and a woman who had given him back his life and asked nothing of him in return but 5 shillings and the humility to wait his turn. He thought of the dented tin flask. He had it still. He had carried it up from the foyer himself the night she left, and he kept it now upon the mantel where he might see it every day. A soldier's flask, the only thing of his she had ever troubled to keep safe, and the only thing of hers he had left. He did not write to her. He understood, at last, that he had no right to. She had not built her great brick house as a place for him to come and claim her. She had built it because it was worth building, and because she was worth a great deal more than the man who had once weighed her in a foyer and found her wanting. That was the truth of it, and he had earned every quiet hour of his understanding. In Manchester, as the crowd thinned and the new doors stood open to the first patients, Vivian climbed the steps and paused a moment beneath the carved stone of the entrance. She thought, just once and without bitterness, of a cold marble foyer and a pouch of coins, of the long words, not Duchess material, spoken in a smooth and certain voice. They had been right, in a way, those proud people. She had never become a duchess. She had become something they had never imagined a woman like her could be, and the becoming had been entirely her own. She turned, and the bell above the door rang as she passed beneath it, and she went in among her patients to begin the day's work, and she did not look back. She had stopped looking back a long time ago. There was too much, now, ahead of her, worth the looking forward to.